And I want to, just before introducing our experts on this topic, just make a couple of, let's say, obvious points that I think are really quite important. The first one is that there are very real power shifts in international relations at the moment. But I want to make a distinction between power shifts between states and power shifts between states and non-state actors. Now, as for basically the former, I think, that is to say, states and non-state actors, I think the international security debate over the last 10, 15 years has tended to focus on malevolent non-state actors, terrorists, transnational criminal organizations, pirates and others. But I want to focus just on, mention the terrorists at the moment. In other words, what people are seeing out there in political debates is the idea that the big power shift is between established sovereign territorial states and between non-state actors with apparently no or very little territory. Now, there is a lot of evidence to see that there is something of a power shift in this regard in several regions, including the Indo-Asia Pacific, however we define the region. But what we're seeing far less of in the Asia-Pacific region is a power shift between the state and benevolent non-state actors that I would include as civil society groups, NGOs, and the like. What's my bottom line point here? It is basically that in the Asia-Pacific region, the sovereign territorial state remains the paramount actor. And that underpins much of the debate that we're having in this panel and I think throughout the day. But in that context of the state still being paramount in the Asia-Pacific region, of course, it's extremely important that we come to terms with the ideas such as China's rise, India's rise, and of course, the US's decline. So that's my first point, that there is at least a power shift in international relations, but it has to be seen in terms of two different dimensions, state to state, state, non-state. The second obvious point that I want to make is that the South China Sea issue that this panel is addressing basically reminds us that about the nature of conflict and war. And I would say that the international security debate over the last 10 to 15 years has tended to focus on a range of other issues that we're all very familiar with. Terrorism tops that list, WMD proliferation, including North Korea, of course, counterinsurgency warfare after Afghanistan and Iraq, and cybersecurity. These are all hot-button security issues. What the South China Sea issue does is brings back to the top of the international security list the idea of maritime conflict, which I think has been displaced to some extent or forgotten about to some extent over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, in policy terms, I guess what this means is how do we determine in the South China Sea, for example, who's doing the right thing and, well, who is not, and what can we do about it? And basically, for me at least, I always look at these security issues in terms of what is offensive and defensive, what is provocative and non-provocative, what is helpful and unhelpful. And so my outsider, non-expert view of actions in the South China Sea is basically that the land reclamation or the preemptive inauguration of islands, rock islets in the South Pacific, is a provocative set of actions, it's offensive, and it's unhelpful. But again, I don't want to judge that too much because I want to hear our experts on these topics. But my worry is not only a military, economic, or security one. It is also what the Asia-Pacific region, how the Asia-Pacific region sees itself. And I think the South China Sea is potentially capable of putting a huge dent in the Asian region's sense of self-confidence and optimism in relation to other regions of the world. And I think that would be a great pity. But I say all that really as, as I mentioned, an outsider. So to hear more on this, first of all, we're going to hear from Dr. Bradley Kaplan. Brad is in fact a political military advisor with the 3rd Fleet based in San Diego. Very long career record in national security issues. And then Dr. Elsina Wainwright, she is going to speak on US, Australian, and regional states' responses to the situation in the South China Sea. And Elsina is currently associated with the NYU's Cooperation and
Center on International Cooperation. Cooperation is being the key word there. And she's also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Sydney's US Studies Centre. So without any further ado, I'll open the floor to Brad first off, and then Elsina.
Okay, good morning, everybody. The first thing I have to do is I noted with horror that this is being video recorded, so I have to look squarely into the camera and say I am not a U.S. government official, and my remarks are my own opinion and not those of the U.S. government. Thank goodness I got that over with. But I think you'll find I'm connected enough where I will provide some insights that are pretty consistent with where folks across the interagency what they're thinking about with respect to the South China Sea. Now, my thanks also to the conference organizers for inviting me here. It was almost a 4-hour drive from San Diego this morning, by the way. I'm delighted to talk about Australian-US cooperation because I've derived the benefits of that for almost 42 years now. First of all, as a naval officer, I've worked closely with the Royal Australian Navy, who, unlike their British counterparts, do not strut about like peacocks in heat. They're a lot of fun, very professional, and I've valued that opportunity to work with them over the decades. Secondly, I've had the privilege of making 3 port visits to Australia, and Australian reputation for hospitality is well deserved. I have learned one thing over the years: never invite anybody from Australia to your house unless you have a very well-stocked liquor supply. And then lastly, and probably most important, I was the naval attaché to Beijing from the late 90s to the early 2000s. And some of you may remember that unfortunate incident in May of 1999 when US forces inadvertently bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and the Chinese responded by trying to torch our embassy. Well, my Australian friends at the Australian embassy stepped up to the plate. They helped escort us around because obviously driving a car with US diplomatic plates was not a good idea. They opened up their communications facility for us. They provided our security detachment with much needed food and refreshment, and I haven't forgotten that, and I vowed I was going to bring that up and express that vote of thanks. One of the things, as bad as my Mandarin is, that I did learn to say was when accosted in the street is, 我是一个澳大利亚人, I'm an Australian. So this would pretty much guarantee you not being pummeled, and so in that regard, I do consider myself an Australian. Well, to the question at hand. I've been, unlike a lot of academics, I've actually applied the South China Sea. My experience in the South China Sea started in 1975 with the US evacuation of South Vietnam. Over the subsequent decades, I've twice been on ships that recovered refugees from Vietnam. I applied those waters a long time, and I'm well-versed in the operational aspects. This brief is going to focus, my remarks are going to focus more on the strategic aspects, but I'm happy to delve in during the Q&A into any excruciating level detail that you want. So what I want to do in this brief is answer the question, why do we care? All the time I get asked, Brad, why would we risk going to war with China over a bunch of rocks and shoals in the South China Sea? And so I'm going to give you some context that may help you answer that question on your own, and then also describe the narratives from Washington, from Beijing, and the other claimants, and we'll finish up with some of what I think some of the implications for Washington are. So let's talk a little bit about the strategic context. The South China Sea, for you, those of you who are not geographers, extends from Taiwan down to the Strait of Malacca. The waterway encompasses about 3,500,000 square kilometers, so it's a lot of water space. It's bordered to the west by China and Vietnam, to the east by Taiwan, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, and then Singapore to the south. And it Some of the other important things to know about it, and I promise it's the only stuff I'm going to read to you, is 21 of 28 megacities are within 100 kilometers of the South China Sea, 5 million people or more. 21 of 28 in the world are within 100 kilometers of the South China Sea. 50% of the world's oil travels through 7 major choke points in the South China Sea. 50% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of the South China Sea. South China Sea shipping represents half of the world's trade and a third of its monetary values. And it is also an area of major fisheries and, as of yet, unproved hydrocarbon resources, specifically oil and gas, that could be worth trillions of dollars. So that kind of sets the location, the stage, why it's important. Let me talk a little bit about what's going on in Beijing's mind. And I'm fond of saying there are no experts on China, just varying degrees of ignorance. I'm less ignorant about China than a lot of people, but I don't claim to be an expert. The bottom line is, why is China doing this? The answer is because they can, because in some ways, and we'll get into this later, American policy has not been robust enough to deter them from these actions. But there are long-standing reasons that across the elements of national power that would lead Beijing to conclude that securing this area in the South China Sea is their best strategic interest. So first, there's a matter of national prestige. This is an area that China has laid largely historical claims to and has offered some historic evidence to indicate that prior to Western incursions, this was an area that was claimed, and those claims were acknowledged by other regional actors. So that's the nationalistic part. There's the economic part that I talked to you about. There's the fisheries, hydrocarbon resources. Increasingly, China is dependent on the flow of petroleum, oil, and liquids from the Middle East. About 80% of all oil imports come through the Strait of Malacca and up through the South China Sea. So China is interested in securing what we call SLOCs, sea lanes of communication, and the South China Sea plays an important role in that. And then thirdly, the South China Sea provides a buffer between potentially hostile forces, read the US, and the Chinese littoral, the eastern seaboard that historically has been very vulnerable to assault. So the argument here from a Chinese defense planner is, I'd much rather have a TLAM strike one of my South China Sea island holdings than I would that it struck Shanghai. So there's a buffer that's being created here as well. How is Beijing pursuing this? Well, first of all, it's a long-term protracted campaign to assert these sovereign claims. It's been going on since the 1970s. I would argue that in the absence of a vocal pushback from both the United States and ASEAN, Chinese President Xi Jinping has initiated a much more robust, rapid, and aggressive pursuit of that campaign than we've seen in the past. Everybody, I'm sure, is well aware of the militarization of small islands, the buildup of small islands in the South China Sea. I can tell you that in 2012, nobody saw it coming. Literally, nobody saw it coming. So in 4 years, Beijing has turned the equation of status quo on its head. Now, to be fair, Beijing is not the only country that is increasing the scope of its infrastructure in the South China Sea. Vietnam, Philippines, and Taiwan have as well. But Beijing's efforts eclipse everything by a magnitude of 100 or more initiatives that these other countries are taking. So they are significant. Beijing is pursuing these claims using what we call the elements of national power: diplomacy, propaganda, military, and economic carrots and sticks. Now, that's on the economic carrots and sticks, that's easier with some countries than others. For example, Beijing does not have a robust economic relationship with the Philippines. It's hard to threaten to embargo bananas and expect that to have a profound impact on Manila's thinking. But Beijing does have a strong trade relationship with Vietnam, and threatening sanctions carry a lot more weight. The propaganda piece, Beijing's narrative is difficult for Western lawyers and experts on international law to accept, but there is a narrative there, and part of the narrative goes like this. Yes, we signed this thing called UNCLOS, United Nations Convention for Law of the Sea, but that was driven and put together, shaped by Western powers that did not have our interest in mind. We didn't have a fair place at the table. And some of these rules don't apply to us or are not applicable for South China Sea because we didn't have a vote at the table. And in fact, they show charts from the 1940s that show this 9-dash line, this cow's tongue that everybody's aware of, has some standing in Beijing's narrative. Now, the irony is that the US insists that China abide by the principles of UNCLOS, and Beijing has ratified that. Beijing refuses to abide by some of the principles of UNCLOS, and the United States has not ratified it, so, and they have ratified it themselves. So this creates an interesting he said, she said, where the US narrative is that Beijing is not living up to its obligations. Beijing says, who are you to criticize? You haven't even ratified the laws that you're telling us we should abide by. The US position is ratification is not relevant. It constitutes, UNCLOS constitutes what our lawyers call customary law and is observed and accepted by the US. So that's kind of the Beijing's perspective where they're going on this. It's, as a wannabe international lawyer, I can tell you it's clever. UNCLOS really does not address taking a rock, turning it into an island, and putting a military facility on it. And the US argument is, since it doesn't address it, you can't claim sovereignty around it. Chinese narrative is, this is a new case and needs to be adjudicated bilaterally between Beijing and the other claimants. Okay, so that's where the PRC is on this thing. The other South China Sea claimants include Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia, who I'm going to dismiss by and large as not major players in this. The two major players are Vietnam and the Philippines. I recently did a study of looking at use of force in the South China Sea over the last 50 years. Almost all the incidents involved China, of course, and either the Philippines or Vietnam. But what surprised me was the Philippines has been aggressive to include using deadly force to defend their sovereign interest. A major exception to that rule is what we saw happen in 2012 in Scarborough Shoal that the Philippines claimed, where basically they allowed Beijing to bully them out of that. And now Beijing maintains a permanent presence in that area, and it's basically been ceded by Manila. The other claimants are trying to maintain status quo, maintain enough credibility that they can retain their sovereignty over their island holdings, primarily in the area to the north and west called the Paracels, and to the south and east called the Spratlys. The major claimants, again, are Taiwan, Manila, and Hanoi. Ironically, one of the few things that Taiwan and Beijing see eye to eye on is South China Sea sovereignty. The same maps that Beijing uses used to be Republic of China maps, and so there's very little disagreement across the strait in regard to that, although if you follow the news, you can see that Taiwan President Ma recently visited the island outpost of Itu Aba and got a lot of criticism from Washington about it. One of the concerns, and it hasn't proved to be completely validated, but somewhat validated, is Beijing's actions are precipitating an arms race in the South China Sea. Now, we haven't seen this particularly with the Philippines, although they have acquired some Coast Guard cutters from the US, and frankly, Beijing's actions have driven Manila closer to Washington. But we have seen it in Vietnam, and Vietnam has purchased Su-27 flankers from Russia. They purchased Kilo submarines from Russia and Leopard-class guided missile frigates in attempt to develop enough combat power to deter, but with the understanding they cannot defeat the PLA Navy juggernaut that's posed just to the north. Now, this brings us to the U.S. strategic approach. And this is where it's important to note that these are my opinions. The U.S. has not done well with our strategic approach to the South China Sea. And one of the reasons, and we could debate this all day, so just trust me for now, and you can come back during Q&A if you disagree, is the U.S. ambiguity about the sovereign issues. In other words, we say, we take no issue with this, but we insist that you resolve it peacefully. That has not been helpful. And by contrast, the U.S. in the East China Sea did not do that. We said the Senkakus, which are contested by Japan and Beijing, are under the provisions of the bilateral treaty, Article 5 of the bilateral treaty, and a Chinese use of force against the Senkakus would be justification to invoke the treaty. Lo and behold, in the East China Sea, since the declaration of the ADIZ by China, there's been status quo. Not so in the South China Sea, where we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years this rapid land reclamation and militarization. So to be fair to Washington, we're using some of the same elements of national power, coalition building, trying to influence ASEAN as a body to develop a multilateral approach to resolving this. Freedom of navigation assertions. Lassen was mentioned earlier, and of course, even that we're not doing exactly right, because the controversy is, well, if we had really wanted to make this a freedom of navigation assertion, Lassen should have been doing donuts around that island, because otherwise their actions could be interpreted to be what we call innocent passage, which any ship or aircraft has the right to do. So in some, Beijing's spinning the narrative is this was a win for Beijing because we the U.S., observed innocent passage. I can tell you as a military planner at Third Fleet, this isn't the last of the FONOPs you're going to see. There will be a continuous pattern of FONOPs, both air and surface, as the U.S. tries to assert its interests. Now, I mentioned the use of force between the Philippines and Vietnam. There have been 2 major confrontations between China and the U.S. in the South China Sea over the last decade and a half. The first was 2001, the EP-3 and Chinese F-8 collision. I was down on Hainan Island as a senior naval representative during that time frame, and it was a very unpleasant experience. And then, of course, many of you have read about USNS Impeccable, which was a survey ship that was harassed by Chinese fishing boats. So first of all, why is the U.S. doing that? I'm going to be honest. This is, again, one of those, my opinion, not the government opinion, because we don't trust the Chinese. And we want to keep an air and surface picture so we can conceptualize a potential battle space and understanding what the Chinese are up to, and understand, if we had to, how we would use the environment to defend our interests. China, understandably, doesn't like that. They reckon it to a thief who's peering in their window and threatening your interests. Not necessarily violating the law, but violating the spirit and intent of the law. So this lack of mutual trust is creating a great deal of friction. Let me close by just talking about implications for the U.S. Again, my opinion, we lost round 1. There's all these islands, rocks and shoals have been turned into fairly substantial islands. The militarization of those islands is ongoing, and with great respect to Foreign Minister Bishop, don't you believe Xi Jinping for 1 minute? Those are military facilities that are going in there under the guise of dual use and civilian facilities. And that goes by, why would they want to do that? The buffer zone and to control the airspace. So what's the best the U.S. can hope to get out of this? Well, I think the best we can hope to get out of this is that some kind of accord, hopefully multilateral, can be reached such that freedom of navigation is guaranteed. In other words, China doesn't declare an ADIS, which I think is very likely that they're going to do once they get those runways up and running. And more importantly, China doesn't unilaterally restrict all of these special missions, reconnaissance missions that the U.S. does. And thirdly, one of the most draconian possibilities that I've seen discussed is China would set up a vessel traffic separation scheme in the South China Sea, similar to what the U.S. and Canada have up in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And they would do this under the guise of safety, and they would say, you've got to check in with us here, transit this route, check out with us, and pre-notify us. That is anathema to a Washington who have been couching strategy in terms of mayhem, which insist on unfettered access to our overseas markets. There is a critical role that Australia can play in this, and at this point I think I'm going to stop and turn it over to my distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Brad.
Elsina.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here at UCLA today, and thank you to the conference organizers for having me. It was lovely to fly out of New York yesterday, out of all that snow, and to arrive here and see such an Australian environment. It made me feel quite homesick, so I'm delighted to be here. And I'm also delighted to follow on from Geoff today and Brad. And Brad, that was a tour de force. There is very little left for me to say. That was fascinating. I will just make a couple of points from my perspective about the US response. And I'll also then go on to talk about the Australian response, and then very, very briefly, the broader region, other regional powers response. In terms of my views on the US response, Brad asks the pertinent question, why should we care? Well, we should care because the South China Sea is a potential flashpoint. This is a place where US-China tensions are sharpest and can most easily drag them into conflict. So that's why it matters. The question of alliance entanglements with the Philippines is one which I'll mention in a moment. Now, the broader regional context is China's rise. And what we're seeing is the strategic environment is becoming more complex. It's becoming more contested. And I'll just make a few points about China's rise. Firstly, it's not inevitable. It's likely, but we shouldn't assume that this trajectory is just going to be linear. And I think that the fluctuations in its economy recently and the difficulty should give us pause, and also the difficulty of the economic transition which is underway in China should give us pause. Notwithstanding, and not also to speak about the financial jitters in the world market. So this trajectory is not inevitable. The second point I'd make is that if China's rise does continue, then US power in the region, its relative power, will inevitably decline. But US absolute power remains unmatched. And there are a number of dimensions to US absolute power. An important one, and I will talk a bit about this, is US alliances and US partnerships. The United States has over 50 global allies. In the Asia-Pacific region, the US and Asia-Pacific allies constitute 1/3 of the global economy at $25 trillion. Now, US allies bring an enormous amount of capacity to bear and augment the United States' ability to project power in the region enormously. So I just wanted to make that point that we are talking about China's rise, and this is going to lead to a structural transition, and that's why we have such flux underway, and we have the flashpoint that is the South China Sea. And that's why it matters, and that's why we're talking about it today. But notwithstanding China's rise, US power globally remains unmatched. Now, just to come back to Secretary of Defense's Ash Carter's formulation which he made at the Shangri-La Dialogue in May last year, which we've heard ever since. He said that the United States shall fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, as US forces do all over the world. This has been repeated many times since. And I thought his speech at the time was very interesting because he situated the South China Sea within this broader context, that the United States wants to maintain regional stability, it wants to maintain the rules-based order. And he made the point that China was not in sync with the rest of the region on the South China Sea. But he also did something very interesting, which I'll come back to in the end. He said, he gave China an in, if you will. He said that the United States wants an Asia order in which everybody rises and in which everyone wins, rather. And that was a very important point to talk about, or to prefigure an inclusive regional order, an inclusive regional architecture, which provides space for China. Now, looking at the US response, I wanted to broaden it a bit and look at the US rebalance in the region. And what we've seen as the United States has seen what's gone on in the South China Sea, and more broadly with China's rise, is their forced dispersal throughout the region. So you've had an expansion of their geographic focus from kind of a 4-decade focus on North Asia to bring it down to the Southeast Asia and also South Asia. And we've seen also a realignment of bases, not just from a focus on Japan and South Korea, but also building up Guam, having the rotational deployment, marine presence in Australia. And I want to make the point here that what we've seen happen because of this changing strategic environment is that Australia has become a more important ally, I believe, to the United States. This is in part driven by Australia's geography. It is to the south of these sea lanes we're talking about, but it's sufficiently proximate that it's close by, but it's out of the range of the region's growing anti-access area denial capabilities. That's important to the United States. Also, Australia's functionality as an ally is valued by the US. We have very valuable equipment. We have expeditionary capability that not many American allies have, including our amphibious capability. We're modernizing our surface fleets. We have a submarines acquisitions process, which is controversial but well underway. And also we have this established over 30-year routine of Australian RAAF patrols of the South China Sea in our Operation Gateway. The other thing that I think the United States values in Australia is our regional linkages and our regional expertise, which only continues to grow. The United States, for example, has adapted the Australian Pacific Patrol Boat Program, which we use in the Southwest Pacific, in its maritime assistance, Coast Guard assistance to Vietnam and the Philippines, for example. So it's interesting that Australia is becoming, I think, a more valuable ally. We're seeing part of the United States strategy is to strengthen its alliances, not only with the United States, but also not only with Australia and the Philippines, Japan and South Korea, but it's also strengthening partnerships with new partners like Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Now, a lot of this is maritime assistance, assistance with maritime domain awareness, and the President announced a significant $250 million US maritime Southeast Asia assistance package last year. The United States is also increasingly focusing on trilateral arrangements, other minilateral arrangements, and encouraging its allies and partners to form linkages of their own. Another interesting thing the United States is doing is to become increasingly supportive, and now actively supportive, of regional institutions like ASEAN, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, East Asia Summit, obviously. In a way that it hasn't before, I think that there's been a conclusion on the part of Washington that while these remain far from problem-solving bodies, that they have a useful service, a useful purpose, that they provide certainty to US regional commitments, they reinforce operating principles and rules of the road. And this is very important when we get to the operating principles of freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, and forging that regional consensus. I think that the United States administration didn't anticipate President Xi's tolerance for risk in the South China Sea. I think this has caught everyone off guard, and Brad's point about before 2012, no one saw this coming is an excellent one. And there is a real risk here in terms of what's going on. The United States and China, I think, have forged in the last year or two pretty good military-to-military communication pathways, and there have been good confidence-building measures, and that is actually extremely good to see. but the risk remains this uptick in tempo that we've seen in terms of air and naval activity in the region. And what is the risk is that there is an incident and it escalates. And so that is what everybody is trying to, avoid, because neither Beijing or the United States or other claimants or other parties involved, no one wants war. No one wants a conflict here. So it's just how does everyone achieve their objectives short of that. And this entails very complex alliance management on the part of the United States, all of this. They have to manage their obligations to an ally like the Philippines, but without getting dragged into conflict. And I've been very struck, as Brad has, that President Obama made a formal declaration of the United States support for the Senkakus, and that was covered by the Japanese treaty, but there's been no such formal declaration about the Philippines and the Philippines' disputed territory in the South China Sea. So the maintenance of ambiguity there is telling. Now I'll move on to Australia. Now Australian interests, why should we care? Why should Australians care about the South China Sea? Well, our interests are directly engaged as well by what happens there. Australia is a trading nation, heavily dependent on its exports. Around 2/3 of Australia's merchandise trade passes through the South China Sea. So necessarily any encumbrance on freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, that is going to affect Australia's trade. So this matters to Australia. Also, as a middle power, Australia has a significant interest in maintaining the rules-based order, freedom of navigation and overflight. And as an ally of the United States, this matters to us because, as I said, this is a flashpoint. It could drag the United States into conflict with China. We care what happens. But also, it's of interest to Australia if the United States at some point, and I think this is unlikely, but at some point makes a calculation they're going to become less engaged in the region and they're going to withdraw. That matters hugely to Australia. Australia and our vital interests would be enormously exposed. Because Australia, the US alliance makes such sense for Australia. It's the most cost-effective way that Australians have to protect not only Australia, but its vital interests. So if we sense that there was any inclination on the part of the United States to withdraw, to pull back, we would be very concerned about that. So what are Australia's stated objectives? They are the peaceful resolution of the competing claims in the South China Sea, avoidance of escalation of tensions, and the maintenance of the rules-based order. So we don't, like the United States, we don't take a position on the competing claims. So it's a strong declaratory position. And I think there's been significant continuity since Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has taken over. There was some interest on the part of analysts in Australia whether there was going to be a slight break from Prime Minister Abbott's position. But might have been even the Prime Minister Turnbull's first interview after he became Prime Minister, he was asked about the South China Sea, and he described China's South China Sea policy as quite counterproductive. And then in Washington last week, the Prime Minister said that the central focus for China should be stability, that that's key to their prosperity, and that the legitimacy of claims to reefs and shoals should be secondary. Now, there is worry in some quarters of Australia, particularly in some in the business community, that this strong declaratory stance on Australia's part is going to have repercussions in terms of how affecting our relationship, our economic and trade relationship with China. And this gets to a potential fault line, I think, in Australia-US relations, because there is this concern on the part of many. But we haven't really seen evidence that this has affected the Australia-Chinese trading relationship in previous cases, where, for example, Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, made a strong statement against the ADIS in the East China Sea and summoned in the Chinese ambassador in Canberra and voiced Australia's disapproval. But there were no repercussions really to Australia's economic relationship with China. After that, we forged the FTA, continued our strong trade relationship, and our security relationship with China has continued apace. We have had, and I think the Minister might have mentioned this morning, low-level survival exercises which are trilateral that China, the United States and Australia, exercise Kowari, have been held twice in the last 18 months. There have been naval exercises between Australia and China and a port visit with the Chinese Navy, and I believe that might have happened even after the Freedom of Navigation operation in November last year. Australia has quite a robust military-to-military relationship with China. So in terms of other prongs of Australia's strategy in the South China Sea, there's the legal strand, though Australia supports the Permanent Court of Arbitration case brought to The Hague by the Philippines. And Prime Minister Turnbull mentioned in his major security address in Washington last week, UNCLOS. And he said, I think his language was this, he looked forward to US Congress ratifying UNCLOS because Australia makes the calculation that the US ratification of UNCLOS would reinforce international law on these points, and that it makes a great deal of sense to reinforce the existing rules-based order. So I'm sure that in Prime Minister Turnbull's visit last week to Washington, he was talking to Australia's friends in Congress about that very issue. And the last prong that Australia has is the economic one. And Foreign Minister Bishop was very interesting on this in Washington in her speech a couple of days ago, talking about the importance of promoting further economic integration, regional economic integration, and how that is a wonderful tool to offset regional tensions. Now, just to go back to those fault lines that I see between Australia and the United States on South China Sea and more broadly. Australia, there's high public support in Australia for the alliance, the US-Australia alliance, but there's much lower support, public support, when Australians are asked, would you support the United States in a military contingency somewhere like the South China Sea? And I believe that's because Australia tends to view our alliance with the United States as a standalone, kind of separate from regional dynamics, separate from any sense of shared responsibility for maintaining regional order. So there's a fault line there, and the broader fault line is that Australia's regional interests and regional outlook, it's not identical. They're not identical to the United States. We have competing security and economic imperatives, for example. The economic dimension of the Australia-China relationship looms very large for us because it is our primary trade partner, it is a significant economic partner for Australia. Whereas in the United States, the security dimension, it seems to me, is looming ever larger, particularly as China's economy is faltering and as the American economy starts to turn around and is becoming much more robust. So there is a risk of diverging objectives here, it seems to me, between Australia and the United States, that events might unfold in such a way that Australia and the United States reach different conclusions as to what kind of strategic order we're prepared to accept. So that's a fault line that I think both Australia and US government have to keep an eye on. And I'm just going to close talking about very, very briefly on the regional response. And the observation I want to make is just this, that from the Philippines, from Japan, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, even Vietnam, they have all sought to increase their strategic partnerships with the United States in the wake of China's rise, but particularly China's actions in the South China Sea. Now, we can contextualize Philippines and Vietnam, for example, seeking a stronger partnership with the United States in terms of their competing claims with China. But it's interesting to me that more traditionally circumspect powers like Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia are seeking to strengthen their ties, particularly their maritime security cooperation ties with the United States. So what we're seeing in the region is really classic balancing going on against China. And I'll just end on this point, that managing South China Sea tensions and China's rise is going to require a multi-pronged approach. In my view, there has to be a firm maintenance of the rules-based order and a firm avowal of the freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight, and a firm sort of stance on security matters. But perhaps there should be less rigidity where we come to architectural issues, less rigidity where it comes to, say, the United States position on the AIIB, for example, more openness to an inclusive regional architecture. When unilateral groupings, trilateral groupings are formed, to draw in China where you can. Functional exercises like the exercise Kawari, which draws in Australia, China, and the United States that I mentioned before. All those things are good. And I come back to what I said near the beginning, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter's point, when everyone rises. We want an Asia-Pacific order where everyone rises, everyone wins. To maintain inclusivity, to keep China into the architectural order, the rules-based order, but to provide more space for China, I think will go a long way to not only managing South China Sea tensions, but managing US-China relations in the region more broadly.
Well, thanks, Elsina.